Well, good evening, everybody. Uh, my name is Jimmy Gandhi. I'm a professor of engineering management and an associate dean at Cal State Northridge, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everybody who's logged in for our webinar today, which is titled in Engineering Management. And this is going to be a series of webinars that we're going to host, where we're going to bring in experts from industry to talk about various topics. I'm delighted to see you all here and thank you for joining us, because I know we all have a common interest for addressing the complexities of managing and leading engineering projects and teams. And I think this is a particularly crucial time for engineering managers because we're tasked with navigating a wide variety of challenges, from harnessing technological advancements to managing cross-functional teams and delivering projects on time within budget, and all whilst, taking the input from slews of amount of data that we get and having to use that data to make the correct decision while considering the constraints that we have to operate with them. So today we have the honor of two industry experts, Dale Deardorff and Greg Williams, joining us, and they bring a wealth of experience and insights into the realm of engineering management, particularly in the fields of leadership and lean principles. And they'll share their perspectives on key challenges facing our field and explore innovative strategies for overcoming them. So thank you, Dale and Greg, for being here. I really appreciate it. And just a quick introduction of the panelists. So Dale Deardorff worked in the aerospace and technical defense industry for over 30 years, including as a program manager for Boeing Satellite Systems in El Segundo. And immediately after retiring, Dale started his consulting business, the Rocky Peak Leadership Center, and he has a doctorate of management, an MS, an MA, and BA degrees, and several certifications on parallel thinking, lateral thinking, and direct attention thinking tools. And Dale's extensive experience is in leadership management, innovation, and enterprise coaching, and the design and implementation of leadership and innovation systems. And he teaches leadership, management, strategy, and change management courses at multiple universities, including in the Masters of Engineering Management program at Cal State Northridge. And we're very fortunate to have him on our faculty. Moving on to Greg. So Greg Williams worked in the oil and gas industry for 37 years before he retired as a lean director for Aria Energy in Bakersfield, California. And immediately after retiring, Greg started his consulting business, Western Sensei Consulting. And Greg has an engineering management degree from Caltech, a balanced scorecard certificate from Harvard, a lean certification from ASU, and several other professional certifications. And his extensive experience is in lean, continuous improvement, innovation, leadership, and he also does executive coaching and design and implementation of leadership and management systems. And Greg has also been involved with the Association of Manufacturing Excellence for over 23 years and attributes much of his learning and success to his involvement in that organization. So thank you, Greg, also for being here today. I really appreciate you both taking the time. So Dale, I'm going to start with you, right? That you've been in industry for over 30, 35 years. So how has the concept of leadership evolved in the context of rapidly changing industries and technologies such as digital transformations, as well as the increasing use of artificial intelligence in, say, the last 12 to 18 months?
As far as what's really changed in, say, the last 20, 25 years, is the pace of change. I'll call it organizational change, or VUCA is probably the best description for it. Warren Bennis coined part of that term. It's been kind of embraced and accepted in the last couple years. It stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And today's leader needs to have the ability to handle all of that, and be comfortable with it. They've got a dynamic, changing environment every day, and sometimes it changes by the hour. So you've got to set the example for everybody else, that you don't light your hair on fire and run around like you're crazy as a leader when there are changes. So you've got to be adept at being able to handle that. That's just part of the personality of being a leader today. The other piece of it is that you're responsible for creating the culture within your organization. If you're a leader in your organization, you model the behaviors that other people see, and they in turn take your cue. If you're unethical as a leader, then everybody in the organization looks at you and says, well, if he can be unethical, why can't I? So there are very distinct areas that I think, from a challenge standpoint would be, number one, you've got to be authentic. So authenticity, I think, is something that we're now starting to see has got tremendous advantages. In addition to that, you've got to have a people-centric mindset. And we'll probably get into that with some of the other questions, but you've got to look at people as part of a relationship. When we moved away from calling them assets, so about 10 years ago, it was like we said people were our most important asset. Well, an asset is a financial term. And that financial term means that you could get rid of that asset. You could put a dollar amount on them. And if you needed to lay people off, it's kind of like this is the formula for that and things like that. That's not the current model that I think we need to embrace. I think what we've got to shoot for is treating people like they're part of your family. As a leader, you're responsible for the people in your organization. The second piece, you talked about the technical side, maybe AI or some of that kind of stuff. And I know that generative AI is like the big thing right now. I mean, we're talking about the changes to trying to lead activities when you've got those kind of things happening around you. From an academic standpoint, I embrace generative AI. I think it's something that will not only change the roadmap in front of us, but if we do it the right way, if we embrace technology the right way, it can be so incredible. I know that a lot of people are worried that, oh, it's going to take away my job, or it's going to destroy creativity, or, these technical challenges that are going to happen. There's two features of generative AI that I think are really important. One is there's always going to be a human in the loop. So I don't think we're ever going to see a leadership type of situation where you've got the, 2001 A Space Odyssey HAL robot running, Google or, taking over an organization, and that you've created a filtering system where you've got the opportunity for personality, adaption based on what we think the right answer would have been. I think there's always going to be a need for a primary leader to be in the loop. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't get input, constant input that's going to be happening. I attended Innovation 2000 up in Canada, and there were two people that were there. One of them was Edward de Bono, and he was talking about process and systemic innovation and the different methods for it. And Aaron was leaving Disney, and he had come in as a guest speaker also. They were both keynotes. Neither one probably liked each other. They both sat on the stage together. They didn't look at each other. And Edward de Bono would diagram his illustrations on his little rolling screen. And Bran Ferren talked about how, as he was leaving Disney, he was going to start up a think tank. And he started to talk about the things he was going to do. And the one that just totally floored me at that time, and this is almost 25 years ago, he said, we're going to be working in my new company on creating a brain chip, where an augmented chip that you would put into your brain, and it would give you the ability to access your computer. And I mean, the audience, just everybody kind of opened their mouth and went, wow, that's really out there. That's really far out there. We've seen technology change in the last 25 years. I mean, 25 years ago, I was running if I was lucky, I was running a 386 computer. And if not, I was probably running a 286 and begging somebody for a math coprocessor so that I could go faster in a computer. The computer, the reason we got the computer, the typewriter was there before that. The calculator. Think about the technologies that we've kind of stair-stepped through. ChatGPT and generative AI is just one step. 5 years from now, people are going to be looking back at us and going, wow, what was the big whoop about with generative AI? It's just a tool. It's the leader's ability to utilize that technology and have their employees or their, students use it that I think becomes important. So, and I hope I covered all the elements of that question.
Yes, thank you, Dale. So you see it more as a supportive role, and not that generative AI is something that shouldn't be embraced or should be feared, but it's more of a supporting tool that you can use and train your employees and support your employees to use, because it can help increase their productivity in certain ways, which can also help you in turn lead that group or team.
Right. And I think we got to look at it, science fiction becomes science fact. If you look at what we see in the movies, as far as what the world's going to look like in the future, we're poised to try to make those things happen.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to pivot to Greg now. And Greg, since we're talking about changes in recent times, and we now live in a post-pandemic world, how would you say that the application of lean principles has changed in a post-pandemic world? Do you see shifts now with reference to things such as organizations holding inventory? Because previously it was all about minimizing your inventory. Then, when all the risks came up, when there were so many unknowns in your supply chain, people wanted to hold more safety stock because you didn't know if your supplies would come in at a certain time, and by how much they could be potentially delayed. So, what are some of the changes that you've seen related to that? And when you want to apply lean principles, what would your advice be in a post-pandemic world?
As far as the principles don't change. A lot of people, when they talk about the lean principles, they think of, James Womack's work, and they think of, those 5 principles that he outlined in terms of defining value from the perspective of the customer, understanding your value stream, creating flow, where you can't flow, creating pull, and then pursuing perfection. When I talk about the principles of lean, I think a little bit more holistically than that. I mean, those are important, but I also think of maximizing value, and I think of reducing waste, and most importantly, I think about respect for people. That's the foundation of the whole of everything to do with lean. And so, respect for people is a really critical principle that I think that has to be applied. And I have seen changes with respect to. Let's talk about that one. First of all, respect for people. In a post-pandemic, or even through the panel, back up a little bit, not just post-pandemic, but even during the pandemic, the whole concept of respect for people required, we had to give that some thought. It changed tremendously, right? There was a lot of remote work. You weren't seeing everyone face to face every day like you did before. And the way you interact with people are different. The way that you show respect for people is different in this kind of an environment. And so what this really created was a need for leaders to give some serious thought about how do we show respect for people in this type of environment where it's so much of it is virtual, so much of it is remote. And they've had to find new ways to really help people to find fulfillment and joy in their work. And it is different. So there's clearly is a need to have a different approach in an environment where you have a lot of remote work going on. There's also if we talk about not just the principles but the tools, there's different ways of applying the tools in this type of an environment. Think about leader standard work. It's real easy if everyone's in the factory or in the office, whatever work we're talking about, whatever type of work we're talking about, it's really easy for leaders to do their leader standard work, to make sure that standards are being followed, to build relationships with the workers, to build that trust with the workers. and to ensure that, you know, the targets are being achieved and everything's being done, you know, the way that it's supposed to be being done. That's easy when it's in person, but when it's not, when it's more remote, then, you know, it's obviously more challenging to do your leader standard work. But what I've in working with a lot of different leaders, even post-pandemic, it's been really interesting to see the different approaches that they're taking to ensure that those things are still being done, to ensure that people still feel appreciated, to ensure that people still feel valued, to make sure that they're still making efforts to build relationships and to build trust with the people. But it's different, you know. But leaders recognize, a good leader will recognize that that's their responsibility. You know, that the circumstances have changed. You know, Dale mentioned VUCA. I mean, that's exactly, he's right. That's dead on. I mean, that's the situation the leaders are in. You know, those four categories, and so they have to deal with that every day, and they've had to adjust with the application of lean tools and the application of the lean principles. There's a lot of adjustments that are being made, and it's the leader's responsibility to do that. You asked about inventory, and you talk about safety stocks. We have a couple of different types of inventory. We have safety stock and we have buffer stock. And buffer stock, of course, is the stock that you have to maintain to kind of make up for any inadequacy in your production methodologies or in your internal processes, or even customer demand. Whereas your safety stock is more on the supply side. You know, you have to maintain a certain amount of inventory to make up for potential supply shortages or long lead times. You know, it's interesting when Toyota works with their suppliers. One of the things that the Toyota Supplier Support Center does is when they go visit a supplier's factory, if they're on a factory floor, they will, every time they'll ask to see the safety stock and the buffer stock, and they want those to very specifically labeled that way. You know, this, I want your safety stock here, your buffer stock there. And every time they visit that supplier, they expect that size of that stock or inventory to go down. If it's not going down, if it's staying constant, or if it's going up, then they know there's no continuous improvement going on in that area. You know, because you ought to continuously be improving your internal processes and your customer processes so that your buffer stock can keep working down, and then also making improvements in your supply side to make your safety stock go down. But I have been seeing, especially during and post-pandemic, that the safety stock, understandably, is going up. You know, companies are keeping larger safety stock right now because of the uncertainty associated with that. So, yeah, with regard to the application of the lean principles, the principles remain the same, but clearly leaders have had to get creative in terms of how to make sure they're still achieving those things in this post-pandemic world.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, it's interesting that both you and Dale touched upon VUCA, which is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, right? And we're constantly dealing with those four factors, right? There's constant volatility, whether you're working with your supplier, whether you're, you know, and there's uncertainty and there's complexity also, right? Particularly when you look at manufacturing environments. And because of the first three, there's a lot of ambiguity that you're dealing with in a leadership position. And I think that that's why it really requires a unique set of skills, which an engineering manager is likely to have because of the various roles that they play. So with that, I'll pivot to Dale again. So Dale, you know, there's a lot happening currently in a lot of industries, but we've heard a lot from the aerospace industry, particularly around manufacturing and quality. So what's your thought on what sort of role would leadership play in addressing what is currently happening?
Yeah, I guess you can't pick up a newspaper or watch the news in the last week or two without seeing Boeing as a representative of a lot of exactly what you just talked about, the Max 737 issues that they're running into. And all I can tell you is that, and it's a unique case because it's going in a weird way. And by that, I mean, it's the tail wagging the dog in my perception of what's going on. Number one, when you organization that has to have a whistleblower come out to kind of tell the truth as we perceive it, then you've got a problem. As a leader, CEO, or part of the executive team in a super big company like Boeing, you would want to be ahead of the story. Honest and open communication would be one of the things that you would really want to have. And I think you're seeing comments from Indonesia Airlines and a couple of the other airlines saying that we don't think we trust Boeing anymore, simply because of the lack of credibility in the story that they're telling. So if you can pull, the build work up, so if the M-bomb doesn't match, what was delivered from an aircraft perspective, and the 4 bolts were never installed, but the paperwork says that they were installed and an inspector signed off on it also. So when you've got a technician that says, I did the work, and an inspector that says, I looked at the work and I'm buying off on it, and then the story comes out that the stuff may have never been there, then you've got some process and systemic issues in the organization, in the culture. And number one, you've got to own that. It's your organization. And when you sidestep that and you create this us versus them philosophy that, we're good up here, but down there in the shop, it's different, that there's some sort of bad things happening down there. It can't be that way. As the leader, you're responsible. You've got to be accountable, and you shouldn't be waiting for other people to unveil what you already know. So for me, I think, the Boeing situation is probably the worst that you can have in a situation where you've had previous things happen. The battery in the 7, in the 777, they've had, from an airframe standpoint, some major challenges getting to the point where they would be successful from an aerospace company. Now, take a look at Airbus. Airbus is not, Boeing is a single entity company in the United States. Airbus is owned by 4 countries, and they're finding a way to outperform, Boeing. So what are they doing differently? And I think if you pull apart the supply chain potential issues that Airbus runs into, they're way ahead of the curve compared to the way Boeing responds to this. So I just, I find it frustrating every day to hear another story about it. Now, the other piece of that is that Boeing is a big company, and everybody that's working in integrated defense systems and all the other areas, yes, we are all part of the Boeing umbrella, but I think it's a local culture that could be happening in a local area. That would be my 2 cents on that. It reminds me of in the 1970s, if you bought a GM car and the door rattled, and you would go, well, what the hell's wrong with the car? It's a brand new car. And I see Dr. Bellows down here smiling because he's probably heard this story before from Russ Akoff and some of the other people. But if you buy a car in the 70s built on a Friday, there was a chance that there could be a soda can inside the door panel. That was just accepted, that there would be FOD thrown in there. Now, today would not happen. You would never expect to have that type of situation. So yeah, we've gotten better in certain places, but we repeat the same mistakes over and over and over again. I had a really super leader up in the Boeing time that I was working for IDS, Debbie Rube, who sat me down when I
Can you
was,
just clarify to everybody, Dale, what IDS is?
yeah,
Everybody might.
integrated defense systems. So, and she coached me. She said, Dale, it's not a matter of if a supplier is going to become non-compliant with the hardware. It's a matter of when. So as a leader, it's your responsibility to be looking at that. You can't, put the blinders on and say, that's not part of my job. As a leader, you are responsible for everything in the food chain all the way down. And until you step up to the plate and acknowledge that, I just find that we've got pseudo leaders, I guess would be the way to call it. Rather than, for me, a true leader would be someone who would step forward and say, it's my problem. I need to acknowledge that.
Thank you, Dale. You made a very interesting point, right, about local culture versus the larger organization, right? So it's and within Boeing, there's integrated defense systems, and then there's BCA, Boeing Commercial Aircraft, and
Right.
how the culture could be different within those two units, which are still operating within the larger Boeing umbrella. Greg, we'll come back to you, and I know you talked about how the lean principles, the basics of the lean principles are still applicable, but how we apply them, including the tools, have changed, right? So can you share some examples of organizations that have successfully implemented lean in their operations in recent times? And more importantly, what were some of the factors that contributed to their success, considering the challenges experienced in the last 2 or 3 years?
Sure. Um, and I'd actually, if I could, Jimmy, I'd like to really focus primarily on the second part of that question, as opposed to calling out, certain organizations. There are a lot of organizations really across all the sectors that I'm seeing being very effective actually in a post-pandemic world in applying lean business models. And, whether it's, the service industries or energy or plastics or healthcare, even government, there's a lot of great lean work going on, and we're seeing in the Association for Manufacturing Excellence, we have a Manufacturing Excellence Award, and we have a lot of applicants right now, and there's some very impressive organizations that that are going through that process, and so there are a lot of there's a lot of great work going on out there. They're finding ways to apply the concepts, the principles, methodologies, the tools in this new environment. But what I'm seeing in terms of a common denominator for or key success factor in these organizations that are being very effective is the leadership. And I know we hear that all the time, that leadership is the key. I am truly seeing that is where that common denominator is. When you have leaders that recognize that they own the lean management system, or the overall management system, they are responsible, they're accountable to find ways to adapt in this new environment and to make it effective. A lot of organizations that during and post-pandemic, they've completely gotten away from their lean management system, from their lean business models, and it tracks back to the leadership. I think this is a theme that you'll hear from both Dale and me. Is a couple of things you'll hear from both of us. One is going to be that the leadership responsibility. All roads lead to leadership, and I have very clearly seen that in terms of their lean systems and their management systems through this pandemic and post-pandemic. There's a couple of leaders that come to mind. Well, there's several leaders that come to mind, but I'll mention a couple of them by name because they just really, I think they really stand out. And you can look them up on LinkedIn and get to know them a little bit better. But they're amazing leaders, and they're good examples of the type of leadership qualities that it takes to be successful and to thrive in the environment that we're in. One of those is Bob Chapman at Barry Waymiller. I've had the privilege to work very closely with him. An amazing leader. He's a people-centric leader, and he wrote the book Everybody Matters. He's an example of really being able to take this, this VUCA environment that leaders have to deal with and be very successful in that. And another one that I would just call out is Arnel Santos at JG Summit Olefins Corporation. He's currently the president and CEO there. And I worked with him very closely when he was with a prior company up in Canada. And again, just very strong leader and able to pull it all together with his leadership, really sustain lean through everything that we're going through. But I would say that the bottom line between both of those leaders and others that have been successful has been that they've been able to balance both getting business results and also really having a sincere care for the people that they serve, for the people in their organization. And Bob Chapman talks about that quite a bit. When he doesn't, he believes in people-centric leadership and really, he understands it and he practices it every single day. But he'll be the first to tell you that it's not just the people-centric leadership, it's the combination of that and the business results. You have to have both of those if you're going to be a good leader. One of those without the other is not effective leadership. And so that's what I've seen in companies that have been very successful, regardless of the industry, regardless of which sector they're in. I've seen that those that have been very effective in terms of leadership, maintaining that balance between getting business results and really respecting people and being people-centric leaders, that's kind of the right formula. That's the formula that's working. And that's, again, the common denominator that I'm seeing.
So it's about a balance between the people as well as obviously focusing on your bottom line. Do you see any difference, Greg, depending on the size of the organization? Does that kind of bring up a unique set of challenges when you're trying to do that? Whether it's a smaller organization or whether you're talking about a super large organization like Boeing?
Yeah, there's definitely a difference. I had the privilege to work with a small engineering company in St. Louis. That's a small family-owned engineering company, less than 200 people, and the things that they're dealing with in terms of the culture, in terms of the leadership, the business model, all of it, it's different than if I'm working with, like when I was working with Nova Chemicals up in Canada. That's, you're talking about 9 different plants across the United States and Canada, and thousands of employees. In a business that size, you have all of these subcultures, whereas in a small business, you really have one culture. And so the leader's role is to design and to sustain that culture in that organization. But when you have the large organization, whether it's a Boeing or whether it's a Nova or whether it's another company in that magnitude, you're going to have a lot of subcultures, and so the leader's role becomes different, and you need to figure out whether you want to. Some of them choose to actually run the business that way. They're okay with having all of these different subcultures as long as they're delivering results. And others, believe that nope, we need to have a one approach to our leadership model, our business model, our culture. All of that needs to be the same all the way across. So it's interesting, but it's very different, depending on the size of the organization. And I would say that's probably one of the biggest factors, is that the idea of the multiple cultures, subcultures throughout the organization, as opposed to having that one culture in a small company.
Absolutely. Thank you, Greg. Yeah, I think that's a really important point, right? That the bigger you become, how do these subcultures then evolve within your growing organization, and how do you really keep a uniform focus, right? And even as your product line grows, right? The same thing, that you expand, and then there's different functional requirements for different products and different constraints that come into play. And how do you really manage a really wide product line which may have unique needs, keeping a common culture at the same time?
Yeah.
Thank you. Dale, I'm going to come back to you now and kind of just little bit more on your thoughts about that. What role does data analytics play in optimizing processes and specifically in decision making, right? In leadership roles, because we're in a day and age where we are now inundated with data, right? So what role does data analytics play in optimizing your decision making as a leader?
If we were going to look at this in a perfect world, it would be very different than what it actually is. And by that, I mean, from a data analytics standpoint, we probably have more data now than we ever have before. So as a leader, you are constantly inundated with tremendous amounts of data. And then ultimately you're responsible for making, I'll call it the right decision. You know, garbage in, garbage out. So number one, if you've got tremendous amounts of data, you need to make sure that it's good data. So there's got to be some tool set that you use, that you go in and you do a verification. You clean the data, you simplify it, you aggregate it, you then, for most people, have got some level of either Tableau or another tool that they use to create data charts, and then you get presented that data. As a leader, I think you need to look at data and make sure it passes what I call the giggle test. You know, if you look at the data and it's nonsensical, then there's something wrong. Maybe we're capturing data that isn't really relevant, and we're parsing it in or filtering it in. So as the primary leader in an organization, you've got to look, number one, at how many data points are we pulling in and how valid are they? So that's one feature to it. Number two, how are we presenting that data? You know, what's the format for it? You know, are we looking at things that actually simplify things? Are we looking at things that make it more confusing to try to make a decision? And I think it's your responsibility also as a leader to be savvy enough to look for trends, that you should be looking at the data to see what does it tell you, rather than the data telling you what you should do. You should be able to interpret it, and with collaboration of other people, from a decision-making perspective, you should be listening to other voices, because my mindset, my perceptions, my paradigms on how I look at data, in addition to my biases, could influence my decision unless I listen to other people and their interpretation of what this data is saying to them. So as a primary leader, number one, you got to remember that you may be accountable for everything, but you still need to listen to other people's interpretation of how that data could be looked at. But for me, the giggle test is probably the biggest thing. If you've got so much data that you're looking at it and you go, I'm confused, we've got 10,000 data points, start thinking about, do we really need all those data points to get what I'm trying to get to? How do you create something that is simple and usable? Because before all this data happened, people were making decisions, and people were making poor decisions. I mean, and we're making poor decisions now. We don't know the difference between a simple decision, a difficult decision, or a complex decision. And each of them has got its own process. Each of them has got its own perspective on how you should approach it. So part of, I'll call it Leadership 101, or if I was going to send everybody to a leadership academy, there should be a decision-making course or presentation done on how to interpret data so that you can make the correct decision, and provide samples of, I'll call it, companies that have done it wrong. And there's tons of those that are out there. So it's not hard to find examples of that.
Thank you, Dale. Yeah, I think the two key points, right, that really resonated with me was that you mentioned good data, and a related point is the source of the data, right? And why do you need that data? I think that's really, really key, right? Because a thing that a lot of engineering managers struggle with is that, okay, we have all this data, but how do you really make sense of that data? But before you make sense of it, make sure that you are actually getting valid data from an authentic source. Because otherwise, as you said, it's garbage in, and then your decision is basically garbage out. Right. Yeah, I think that's absolutely key, and I think that's one thing that we should emphasize on or focus on as engineering managers, is that the the quality of the data that we're getting, the source of the data, right? Particularly when we work with dozens or hundreds of suppliers, right, for a complex system like an airplane or even an automobile, right? How are we really getting the right data from the suppliers in order for us to make decisions for our end product? So thank you for that. Greg, I'm going to come back to you now, and just since we're talking about automation and about AI technologies and how they've affected manufacturing processes, we hear a lot about them, right? In today's day and age, especially in the last 3 to 5 years. But how has that really changed the? I know you said that the lean principles have not changed, but because we're working remotely and things like that, the whole initial, I guess, mantra, right, of lean was spending time at the Gemba. How has that changed? And what's your perspective on that?
With respect to the AI and automation and those new technologies?
Yes, or like in recent times, right? And including
Yeah.
remote work, because we talk so
Okay.
much about remote work. So both of them, right, Greg?
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
like, how do you still, because ultimately you are you're looking at a manufacturing process, you want to spend time at the Gemba.
Yes. Yes.
But now we have this whole business environment that's really shifted with a lot of remote work and things like that happening. People want flexibility, a hybrid work culture. So
Hmm.
how are you focusing on
Right.
spending time at the Gemba?
Okay. Yeah. With respect to the first part of that around automation and AI, it's recognizing that those are just tools, right? And so we've got some new tools in the toolbox. And I've seen a couple of things. One is that organizations are finding some creative ways to really get value from the AI in particular with respect to manufacturing. One of those has been kind of the coordination of mixed model manufacturing or production, where you've got a lot of different, uh, small amounts of a lot of different designs or a lot of different models, and so you're constantly switching the production line. And before, that was being done primarily with some really effective visual management processes, and those were effective. But I've recently run across an organization that's finding a really creative way to use AI to manage that process as far as the whole mixed model line. So I thought that was interesting. Another thing I'm seeing, though, is that some organizations are really putting a lot of time and resources into trying to figure out how to leverage AI. They're really creating a lot of waste in the organization. They haven't really defined the problem that they're trying to solve. They just know there's this really cool new technology out there called AI, and surely it's going to be a game changer for us. And we need to understand how to apply it to our business. And so they're wasting a lot of time and resources approaching it that way. Whereas, I would say that the right way to approach it would be first define the problem that you're trying to solve, and then which is the right tool to address that. And maybe AI is a really good possibility for that. But just jumping in and saying, how can we apply AI, which I do see multiple organizations doing, I think it's created a lot of waste in those organizations. And also, another way that I see that it being effective is with respect to supplier logistics. Some organizations are finding creative ways to use AI to manage their the suppliers. And Toyota goes way back in terms of having a very sophisticated process for managing their supply chain. And they've been very effective at that for a long time, but it was really they needed to be, because with their just-in-time manufacturing, the suppliers needed to be on time, and so they were very I think ahead of the vast majority of organizations, they really were the leaders in that process for the supply chain. But in terms of Gemba, that is a big issue because, like you say, time in the Gemba is absolutely essential, but it looks totally different today than it did pre-pandemic. You know, it's like in the very first question you asked, you were asking about the application of principles, and I mentioned, you know, leader standard work and going to the factory floor, going to the Gemba, and building those relationships and creating that trust and making sure standards are being followed and targets being met and all of that. So it's obviously more difficult, more complicated to do that now. Some of the ways that I'm seeing people addressing that is really focusing on more frequent communication, because the Gemba, you know, going to the place where the work is done. Well, that may be over a Zoom meeting. You know, that may be going to the Gemba because that workers may be working from their home. And so it's really kind of looking at the Gemba from a different perspective. And you're going to them, but you're doing it through, you know, virtual means. But in order to do that, you need to be effective in terms of your communications. It needs to be more frequent. It's essential that the leader or even the supervisor, whoever, you know, is going to the Gemba, they could be the engineering supervisor, whatever role they're in. You know, they're still building those relationships. They're having effective interactions, and they're able to make sure that you know, that the people on the other end feel like they've been visited. You know, that you know, you as leader, you understand where they're at, you understand, you know, what they're going through, and you have effective conversations with them. It's a whole different approach in going to the Gemba, but it's equally important.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah. Yeah, I've heard a lot about the, you know, the virtual tools being used, and it's just it's an interesting way of looking at things, right? Particularly when you're dealing with a manufacturing line, and you know, and previously we used to actually go to the manufacturing line and then do a walkthrough and then develop your value stream map, right? Whereas now it's interesting to see how that process has evolved using new tools. Whereas you said, you know, you can be on a Zoom call and people can walk you through a manufacturing line, and then you kind of put together a value stream map and send it to your customer, and then they take a look at it. But that frequency of communication is definitely key. So I'm going to ask each of you a wrap-up question, which if you could just give me a short answer in about a minute each, because then I'd like to open up the floor to our audience to ask their questions. So Dale, a quick wrap-up in about a minute, that what we've talked about, what has happened in the last, you know, 10, 15 years, what we've seen happen in the near past. But what are some of the changing trends in leadership moving forward?
So you're asking me to anticipate where we're going to be 5, 10 years from now.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, the leader of the future's got to have a people-centric mindset. It's got to be part of their DNA. In addition to being able to handle VUCA, to be able to take those elements, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, and deal with that within their team environments, create a collaborative environment. I would tell you also there's some great reading material that you can get your hands on. So don't be afraid to read. If you're a future leader coming down the pipe, the one thing you need to remember is, as a leader, you need to probably be a manager also. You need to understand leaderful leadership. You may have to step back and let other people step forward and take the role at certain points in time. And that's a tough situation because we think that the leader should know everything. The leader doesn't know everything, but if they are collaborative and discuss things with everybody on the team, they sure can be very, very smart.
Thank you, Dale. I appreciate that. That's such a point that we can resonate with, right? That because nobody knows it all, and anybody who thinks they do are, well, it's interesting, right? When you come across such people who think that they know it all in a leadership position. But I think, as you said, the key is that how do you then collaborate with others and really then take the right decision? So Greg, for your wrap-up question, in lean, one of the main focuses is waste elimination. So do you see the same type of wastes when dealing with, say, knowledge work as you would see in a manufacturing setting?
Yes, absolutely. This goes back over 20 years ago, but I collaborated very closely with the Lean Aerospace Initiative at MIT. And that was one of the questions that we were asking, in the knowledge worker environment. Do we see the same types of waste we do in the manufacturing environment? And what we ended up doing was we put together a matrix where we broke down the three domains of waste, Muda, Murray, and Murrah. And then we also looked at the seven types of waste that we're all familiar with. And we said, okay, for all of these, first of all, let's define each one of those, which we did. And then we said, how do those show up in the knowledge work? And so we created this table, and it has multiple examples of each type of waste and how it's manifested in knowledge work. And then we also went one step further and said, okay, so what leads to this? What is the cause of this type of waste in knowledge work? And so we ended up with a pretty extensive table of examples of all of these same types of waste we see in manufacturing. We see them, every single one of them, in knowledge work as well. Yes, it is the same. And it really wasn't even a stretch. It wasn't really hard to make those connections. And I'm happy to share the table that we created, if someone is interested in that. They can send me an email. I'm happy to share that with them.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate that. Okay, folks, I know we're almost close to the end of the hour, so I'd like to open it up to some questions from the audience. Yes, Elvis.
Hi, everybody. This is Elvis Enriquez from cohort 15 of MEM. Well, when I was listening to Professor Dale, he mentioned that the leaders of the future will definitely have to have a people-centered mentality. And that resonated to me because I was thinking, how's that gonna tie up to the new generation of leaders that are, well, being formed right now, and if I want to ask maybe the audience, the whole panel, yes, or Dr. Dale, if he can explain or mention what kind of role you think that the generational change is gonna have in that mentality shift of the new leaders, if that makes sense.
I think I understand where you're going with this, Elvis. Say 5 years from now, hopefully a lot of the leaders that you see are not this colored hair. So you're going to see a lot of millennials, Gen X, Gen Y, people stepping into leadership roles. And hopefully there's a good diversity associated with them. We've got to get away from thinking that our perspective of what a leader looks like is a certain visual image. Everybody has got leadership capability and capacity. Everybody can be a leader and is a leader at different points in time. It's just a matter of, do we tap in and use those resources? So if you're somebody that's got more hair color than I do, and you're moving down that path towards wanting to get into leadership or getting into a stronger leader's position, I would say find a great mentor. Find somebody that you can trust, that you admire, that's authentic, that walks the talk and talks the talk, that has the values, the moral structure that makes you want to work for them. And we all know who that is. You know it when you see it. You may not be able to articulate it sometimes, but you also know the opposite. We've all worked for a leader that sucked, or that was just not trustworthy, that didn't have the capabilities that you want them to have. And I can tell you, I personally have run as fast as I could away from those kind of environments. Or I assumed they were going to get moved to another position, whether they were promoted or just laterally moved, and I would try to stay where I'm at. But I want there to be diversity of thinking. I want there to be diversity of the ability to bring in multiple thought patterns. from a
Mhm.
collaboration standpoint. Did I answer your
Mhm.
question, Elvis?
Yes, yes. Maybe just a final remark on that. If you, I wonder if you think that this is going to be coming more from the academia, or do you think this is going to be formed like in the practice of leadership and businesses? You think this is coming more from one side or the other?
I think it's coming from both sides, to be honest with you.
Mhm.
I don't think you're going to find that academia is going to drive what's happening at Google. Not that they don't embrace academia, but I think that what you're going to find is that the companies that are successful are going to be successful because they figured out the formula. They've got the mojo. They understand how to have that conversation with their people. Their leaders understand their responsibility. And there's nothing faster to fail with a company than somebody that's a poor leader.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Dale. I think
Yeah,
that is an absolutely key point, right? That it's definitely not going to be driven by one or the other, but the industry people definitely have to take the lead. And our responsibility in academia is how do we train the people, right, when they come to our programs. And I'd like to point everybody to our engineering management program, and Dale teaches in that program, and these are some of the skills that we constantly encourage to be inculcated in the students, right? Because we want to make sure that it's both academia and industry that have to work on making these changes happen. Freddie?
Can I put a quick shout out for 3 books that I want anyone that's a leader that I think is essential. So number 1, Russ Akoff, Redesigning Society. I want you to go read this, and I want you to ponder it. The next piece was the Bob Chapman book that Greg talked about, Everybody Matters, People-Centric Leadership. And then there's another book called Broken by Paul LeBlanc. He used to be the president of Southern New Hampshire University, and it talks about broken systems. These are the kind of books that I want you to start to embrace. So sorry I plugged those particular areas.
Freddie, you had a question?
Oh yeah, my name's Freddie Biggs. I'm in school to become get my certification in cybersecurity, and my main focus is to study to get my master's degree in business administration, become a project manager. And my question is, I have here, how do I go about getting? I have 2 questions. One is, how do I go about getting a pattern for my microchip? I'm working on designing a microchip that's going to be ran off of solar energy. And my next question is, how do I present a presentation on a Zoom call to display my program I am displaying? So, so I just want to have know how do I conduct more courses on Zoom where I could showcase my work, have like a share screen, do my presentation, what I'm researching on. So.
Well, I think I can take a shot at answering that, Freddie. I think to answer your first question about the patents, it's obviously an involved process. So you need to evaluate your technology and then file patents based on the claims that you have. That's actually a skill that you can learn by yourself, or you can even learn in a program like in our engineering program. And I'd be happy to have conversations with you about that that one-on-one. And I think what you're also talking about is pitching your idea, right? And that's whole about the entrepreneurial mindset, and how do you really create that entrepreneurial mindset and share your product to the correct audience whilst clearly displaying the value proposition, right? And I think Dale has just added to the chat that LinkedIn Learning also has some great tutorials for what you're talking about. I'm going to be mindful of the time, folks. So Ethan, if you can share your question.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you, guys. Quick question. So I've been exploring a lot about leadership structure. Is there an effective structure that can encourage the type of leadership that Dale, you've been talking about people-centric. I've been reading about a lot about a company called Cordoba Corporation. They seem to have a very linear, flat leadership structure, whereas a lot of organizations tend to have a hierarchy. Is there something that's kind of preferred based on you guys' experiences to encourage a people-centric mindset to all employees, not just the person that wants to do it first?
Yeah, I'm gonna take this and I'm gonna hand this one off to Greg, and I'm gonna tell him to explain about the AME program and their fundamental structure that they've got for people-centric leadership, because I think that would be exactly what Ethan is looking for.
Yeah, so just I'm going to try and be real brief here just because of the time. So if you go to ame.org, one of AME's part of the vision is creating, this is helping organizations with their people-centered leadership efforts, and there is a whole program around that AME has that you can find at ame.org, and there's a people-centric leadership course that you can take. But there's also just a lot of resources available online with videos and also with presentations. And the book that that we've talked about a couple of times, Everybody Matters with Bob Chapman, that's a great resource. He went through university and he learned the way that they teach you how to manage in universities, and that's not a people-centric approach. And so he goes through his whole journey, how he got from there to being a world-class people-centric leadership or people-centric leader. And so he takes you through, real life examples of him growing and running his business, and the kind of the way that the journey he went through, and then the system that they ended up developing and they've shared around the world. And so I think that'd be a really good resource for you as well, Ethan, is to take a look at that book, and because you got real world examples, and you have, in that book, and then also through ame.org, you can find some really good resources there. And I'm happy to share other resources with you as well.
Great, thank you.
There's some good YouTube tutorials also that AME's got out there.
Thank you, Greg, for your responses, and thank you, Ethan, for that question. Okay, Marcos, we'll make you the last question before we wrap it up for the evening.
I know in an organization there's a lot of different waste streams that are possible, but I've found personally that a big one that kind of goes unrecognized is that there can be sort of interdepartmental or interpersonal conflicts that kind of grind a whole organization to a halt in some instances. So in a case like that, where, say like a manufacturing department and a quality department, or just two individuals within the same department have issues, do you have a default or like a strategy, a pattern that you go to deal with sort of these issues between people or departments that could kind of inhibit productivity or cause slowdowns, cause problems, things like that?
You're talking about conflict resolution between two different departments?
Yeah, so I suppose so, yeah.
Yeah, and I think if you look at it from that perspective, there's a tremendous number of tools that are available, but a savvy leader typically has the capability of understanding that you got to bring both people together, and you've got to find out from a perspective of what is causing the problem. If you let it stew and these two sides just continue to beat each other up or talk bad about each other, or butt heads, it's not going to do you any good. So as a leader, one of your responsibilities is conflict resolution, and leadership is not easy. Anybody that tells you that being a leader is easy is feeding you a line of what. You're going to have to get into the trenches sometimes, and you've got to sit down with people and ask them what's going on. And you may need to coach them, you may need to reprimand them, you may need to potentially move people around. There's a variety of skill sets that you have to kind of play with. But the longer you let that kind of situation fester, the worse it's going to become.
And if I could add to that, just one of the things I think leads to a lot of conflict between internal suppliers and customers, between departments, if you will, is unclear expectations between each other. a tool that you can use to help with that is SIPOC, where you're, for each process, you're looking at the suppliers, the inputs, the process, the outputs, and the customer, and you negotiate those terms with the suppliers and the customers, and so you're creating this common shared expectations and understanding and commitments. And something else I've seen that I thought was creative and it was very effective in one organization that I went to was a department would have all of their any department that they interface with, whether it was a supplier or a customer internally. They were on the wall there, and they had a flag, and that flag was either green or red. If everything was, no concerns, everything was on track with that particular department, you see a green flag there. Anytime there's any concern, it could be any kind of a concern. They just throw a red flag up there and makes it very obvious. So we need to talk. And so it was a way of calling out there's something we need to address here. But again, that those expectations and those negotiations, those contracts that you have interdepartmentally are the source of a lot of conflict, I think, when those are not clear.
Okay, I thank you. I appreciate both your inputs there.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Dale. I know we said we took the last question. There is one question in the chat, Greg. If you could address that in a minute, because I don't want Art's question not to be addressed. So he says that, is it possible a virtual Gemba could be intimidating to those being observed by someone holding a camera?
Yes, is the short answer. I saw that firsthand, actually, in visiting a company. It was actually in Mexico. This company was having a virtual tour, if you will. They couldn't do physical tours because of COVID, and so, but they were still conducting virtual tours, and so all that they knew, the workers were on the line, they were working, and but then someone shows up with a camera, starts asking them questions, and they don't know who's on the other end of the camera, and it is intimidating, and so it was. One of the things that we learned in doing that was it was really important to be respectful to the people that you're going to be interacting with, and explain to them who's on the other side of the camera and what is the purpose for, why are you there, and what kind of questions might you be expected to answer, and doing a little bit of work ahead of time just to make people comfortable with it, because absolutely that can be very intimidating. Especially when you don't know who's on the other side of the camera, who you're even talking to, or who's watching you. So yes, I think it can be intimidating. I think you just have to be purposeful and respectful and doing your due diligence ahead of time with those people.
Stating clearly who's on the other side of the line and why are they on the other side of the line, right? Because who is this weirdo looking at me on a camera, right? So I think establishing that initial connection is absolutely key. Everybody, I'd just like to thank you again for taking the time to attend this webinar. This will be one of the a series of webinars that we do for engineering management. So please do stay tuned to our website. And on 21st of February, we have a info session that's going to be talking about our program, where we are actually including these skills that Dale and Greg are talking about, and we'll probably do another of these webinars sometime in the March or April timeframe. So stay tuned. Thank you again, everybody, for attending, and most importantly, Dale and Greg, thank you for your time. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us.